I always figured that a video like this would be a little too remedial when compared with my usual work. But unfortunately, if I am to go by an awful large number of similarly negative and rather silly comments on my previous two videos about the Battle of Rorke's Drift, well, apparently it still needs to be said because a lot of people pretty surprisingly don't seem to understand what the word victory means. So once more into the breach, here we go. It's Brandon's historical hot take, which has been generously sponsored today and brought to you by Skillshare. Yes, the British won the Battle of Rorke's Drift, and the Zulu lost the battle. Now that isn't a moralistic or qualitative claim, something which unfortunately it seems like a lot of people do not seem to be able to grasp. The British won the battle. That doesn't mean they were the better moral agents, and it does not mean that they were better soldiers. It doesn't mean that they deserved to win, it just means that they did. It only means that they were victorious at that specific instant. Reading anything else into those words is dishonest and attempting to shift the discussion in a very different direction. But still, before I can go about proving that the British did win, naturally we must first define what that actually means. What exactly is a military victory? Well, obviously the term itself can be very broad and widely applied, so trying to get at a true definition, which means, of course, that which describes a being as itself and nothing else, or perhaps that which sets an individual being apart from all other beings, or that kind of very definitive definition can be quite difficult to get. All the same, I have a proposal which is, I hope, rather straightforward and inoffensive for how we might define a military victory. In warfare, the victorious entity is that which achieves its ends contrary to the ends of its opponent. Simple, I think, and fair, right? Hold on, Brandon, you may be saying to yourself. That's definitely way oversimplified. Like you said yourself, definitions are tricky business, and warfare is a complicated thing. No battle, be it an old-style two armies meeting on a field, spitting fire at each other for a few hours and then one side runs away, or even one of these sorts of newfangled Verdun-style battles where the battle is actually more like hundreds of different little mini engagements along like a multi-mile wide front over 9 months, nor really any other possible kind of battle. No matter what the context is, no matter how it's being fought, no battle is ever independent or separable from a wider context. Now here's where we get Clausewitzian with it, so get ready. Warfare is holistic. It is inherently a political, cultural, and economic struggle, among many other different things, as well as, or in addition to, being a struggle of arms. When two forces enter into a combat, each side is doing so with its own objectives. Now, yes, sometimes those objectives are pretty straightforward. We seek to destroy the enemy, and they seek to not be destroyed. But other times, it isn't so easy, it isn't so straightforward. Inevitably, there are instances in which multiple entities with their own different ends might each achieve those ends independently of each other. For example, say two armies are engaging each other in what ironically turns out to be a mutual attempt to pull the other side's forces away from a more important offensive elsewhere, that they're trying to distract their enemy. In that sort of scenario, it is entirely possible that both armies, because they are both distracting the other side, actually both independently meet their own objectives. So does that invalidate my earlier definition? Because both sides are achieving their objectives, so how do you work out who wins? No, I dare say that it doesn't invalidate the definition. If a victory demands not only that one's own objectives be met, but that such is done contrary to the ends of one's opponents, then you cannot have a mutual absolute victory between two opponents. You can have partial victories and whatnot, but we don't want to get into the weeds too much with that kind of thing. That could be a topic for another day, another situation. But as it is, no army, by definition, can have as its goal to be unwittingly distracted by their opponent. If they wanted it to happen, well, then it really isn't being distracted, it's more of a feint. They're willingly entering into it as a sort of risk assessment type thing. It cannot be the case that an army's end or objective is for its own objective or ends to be thwarted. That would be a paradox. I cannot want to achieve that which I do not want. It doesn't work that way. As such, even if each side in this pretend scenario manages to distract their enemy, they themselves were also distracted, and as such, both have failed to meet the definition of victory. Basically, it's a much larger version of two lancers, say, charging into each other and killing each other in the process. Both actions, while a partial success, they killed the other guy, they were ultimately a failure because they also died in the process. But then, of course, where does that leave things like suicide missions? I mean, what if that Lancer is purposely putting himself in a position to be killed in order to get at the enemy? Or what if that army knows it's being distracted, but it doesn't know from what exactly, and it still is doing that. It's still allowing itself to be distracted in the faith that their mission is more important than the enemy's mission. Kind of a weird way to phrase it, but I think you get the idea. And in which case, a part of their end, a part of the end of the individual agent being, for the Lancer, death, or for the army, getting distracted, while it's still a bad thing, it's not unwitting. It is part of the end. A suicide mission has in its conditions, you could very well die. That doesn't go against the purpose of the mission. It is purposefully included in the objective with the idea that the ends might justify the means. To put it more simply, death does not inherently mean defeat. And how can that be? Well, we need to look at the wider context. The individual Lancer may die, yes, but maybe he knows that the enemy's cavalry is more important than his own sides. It's like trading a pawn for a knight. He's trading up for his army, the price being his own life. It's part of the objective. And say an army willingly moving into that trap or a distraction is also killing itself or some of its allies down the line or whatever. There is some negative thing happening because the army is knowingly going into this trap. But they are doing so in a gamble that their simultaneous distracting of the enemy manages to win the day elsewhere. If that gamble succeeds, even if they themselves die, if it still, if it plays into the overall plan, if going into that trap makes it work out for the army on the whole, then in a way we can say that they are victorious. But if the distraction that they pose turns out to be of lesser value than the one of their opponent, if they spring the trap, but in doing so they don't achieve their ends elsewhere, that was the entire reason that they're trying to spring the trap to begin with, well, even if they live at the end of the day, the gamble was a failure and they have lost. Remember, warfare is holistic. No sacrifice is without context, and it is context which separates stupidity from heroism and defeat from victory. I can spring the trap, but if I do so knowing that you're actually screwing yourself over when you're killing me, well, then I kind of win in the end, even if I die, because I knew that was going to happen going in. Anyways, let's remind ourselves of that definition that I gave earlier. A military victory occurs when one force achieves its ends contrary to the ends of its opponent. I think that's pretty fair. Maybe it isn't perfect because it isn't really something that I've been dwelling on for too long, and it's not really been subjected to very rigorous testing. I could probably make this a 3-hour-long video if we applied enough tests to the thing to see if the definition really works. But for our purposes today, I think it's close enough to write that it'll be beyond satisfactory for what we're trying to do today. All the same, of course, if anyone else out there has any better, more refined potential definitions, I would absolutely love to hear them. Or similarly, if there are any very specific situations that don't seem to fit in with that definition, well, I'd love to hear those as well, and maybe they can be discussed in a future video as we try to work out exactly how to best define a military victory. But all the same, for our purposes today, the encounter at Rorke's Drift is really a fairly straightforward one. And while I do believe that the discussion of how we define the term victory is important, until I saw all the aforementioned silly comments, it isn't really a one that I would have ever felt was necessary for this battle in particular. Like maybe Bunker Hill we can debate who really won, that kind of thing, but not really for Rorke's Drift. All the same, at long last and without further ado, the reason why we're all here, right after a word from our lovely sponsor, Skillshare, of course.
Skillshare!
And I am really excited about this sponsorship because I think it really actually relates pretty well to my own work. And I've been really enjoying their service personally, like not just professionally at the required amount to be able to recommend it, but actually personally enjoying it in my own free time. Skillshare is, in their own words, an online learning community where you can find thousands of different classes and workshops on all sorts of topics, from things like computer animation and graphic design to more liberal arts like creative writing or art classes. And funnily enough, I kind of owe the creation of this video to Skillshare, not just because they sponsored it. You all know that it's been a rather shameful length of time since I've last uploaded something. And I can make excuses all day if I wanted to, but honestly, a big part of that was just plain old procrastination. Well, when I was looking into Skillshare, one of the first classes that I found was called Productivity with Purpose, Your Foundation for Success, by Rich Armstrong, which really helped me, honestly, to get through that slump. What I loved about the class was that Mr. Armstrong took a concept that I'd call backwards design, which is exactly what it sounds like, you're just designing something backwards, and he applies it to life and goal setting. It was basically a really interesting, a more compelling way to ask the question, where do you want to be in 5 years? And it got me thinking about some things in a pretty different light, sort of a clearer way as far as what the point of all this YouTube stuff really is for me. So if you'd like to learn more about Skillshare, and I'd even recommend it even if you've been there before, because they're always launching new premium classes, then I'm happy to say that the first 1,000 of my subscribers to click on the link in the description down below, it's a lovely thing, wouldn't you say, will be able to get a month-long free trial. And when you join, you're not only getting access to thousands of hours of solid advertisement-free content, but you are helping me and this channel as well. Thank you so very much for supporting the sponsors that support myself, and thank you to Skillshare for being that sponsor. I hope that we can hear from them again in future. Right then, to our question, did the British really win the Battle of Rorke's Drift? Yes, you silly person, of course they did. Now, I won't bore you all once again with reciting exactly what happened at the battle. If you made it this far in, then by God, odds are you already know exactly what happened. And if not, then I already have a video titled, How Did the British Win the Battle of Rorke's Drift? But let's look at the overall positions. It was just after the Battle of Isandlwana in which some 1,800 British Empire troops were annihilated by 10 times as many Zulu. A part of that same Zulu force was tasked with circling around the British force and camping itself on the Anglo-Zulu border in order to cut off British supply lines. They were explicitly ordered not to cross the border, but were meant to stay there purely on the defensive. However, seeing the weakly defended British supply depot and field hospital at Rorke's Drift, Prince Dabulamanzi, the Zulu commander, decides to break with his orders, push past the border, and attack the outpost. The Zulu would launch multiple waves of attack against the British well into the night, each of which ultimately failed to take the garrison's fortified position. By the early morning, the British were nearly out of ammunition, and another Zulu charge, if it was at strength, might arguably have broken them, but the Zulu themselves were also exhausted and hungry, having no food supplies for themselves after so many hours of harsh fighting, and they had suffered severe casualties, and to make matters worse for them, a British relief column was already well on the way, which certainly would have overpowered the Zulu should it have arrived while they were still there. As a result of all these factors, the Zulu leave the field of battle. Now I ask you, my dear viewer, if any portion of that story even hints at anything other than a British victory. The Zulu objective was to take Rorke's Drift. That much is obvious. It wasn't to expend British ammunition. The mission wasn't to distract the tiny little garrison force from something else. I mean, they were just sitting there. The objective wasn't to scare the British or deny this small handful of wounded soldiers medical care for like a couple of hours while the battle was waging. de Boulamanzi wanted the old mission station for its supplies and to deprive the British of a valuable position which they had previously used as a launching-off point for their invasion. The Zulu failed categorically in achieving that objective. And admittedly, I'm not an expert on this battle. There are individuals out there, and assuredly many of them in the comment section down below, who know infinitely more about the battle and the exact details than I ever could. But I genuinely cannot fathom any other primary objectives for the Zulu in this entire encounter that would have ended in a success for them. And again, that isn't inherently a mark against the Zulu. It's not insulting them as men, as warriors, as a people or a culture, anything like that. I'm sure that those warriors fought very bravely, very well, and I'm sure that they did the absolute best that they could. But that doesn't change the fact that even if it was because of factors outside of their combat prowess, like their lack of supplies or whatever, at the end of the day, they still failed to achieve their objective. It's as simple as that. If they had never entered into the battle, more of them would have lived, they would have been in a better position, and the material position of the British wouldn't have changed at all. They could have been, the Zulu could have been literal gods of war, the perfect warriors. But at the end of the day, they still didn't win. Meanwhile, let's look at the British position. I mean, man, they were battered by the end of that battle. They were exhausted, they were hungry, their fortifications had been broken down to the final level, and their ammunition was practically gone. But you know what? Their objective was to hold the position and survive long enough for the relief to arrive. And that's exactly what happened. Lieutenant Chard didn't have any pretensions of forging out and slaughtering every last of the Zulu. He didn't want to march to Ulundi and burn it down himself. He wanted to survive, to hold the position. And by the end of the day, even if they were in a horrible state, even if their position was insanely precarious, those objectives were still met. It doesn't mean that they were good or bad soldiers. It doesn't matter if they were the good guys or the bad guys or whatever. At the end of the day, they achieved their ends and prevented the enemy from the same. That's a victory. Honestly, by any definition I can imagine. I don't see how that can't be one. And now, the refutations. You call that a win? A Pyrrhic victory at best. Another translation of that comment could very well be, you call that a victory? It was a victory at best. Again, the term victory doesn't suddenly mean that it was a strong victory or even that it led to further victories. The term Pyrrhic victory refers to an affair in ancient history in which a Greek army defeated a Roman one, but in doing so, the end result of the battle was bad enough for the Greeks that they couldn't continue with their campaigning. It was a victory that effectively ended their ability to wage war. Now, these lines can definitely get pretty muddy with certain kinds of battles, depending on where exactly you draw the outline, if you will. You know, questions of exactly when the battle starts and ends aren't always really clear, especially again in those more 20th century style conflicts. But thankfully, like we said, Rorke's Drift is pretty straightforward. It's a pretty, self-contained operation. The Zulu didn't achieve their objective, and the British did. Indeed, the British victory did not in any capacity negatively impact their overall ability to wage the war further. It harmed that specific force, but that force wasn't even intended to be carrying on a campaign anyways. They were a garrison force. The Zulu, inflicting a couple of casualties at Rorke's Drift did not somehow end the British ability to wage war. So even if we do describe this as a Pyrrhic victory, although technically I don't think that the term really applies, well then that is still a victory. I mean, it's literally in the name. It's a victory. Your opinion of the actual events/facts are so misleading to the reality of history as a subject. The British Empire got its, naughty word, kicked in that day. Ignoring how extremely constructive and polite that comment is, how exactly is the successful defense of numerous waves of near overwhelming numbers of enemies getting one's, naughty word, kicked in? Unless, of course, you're referring to Isandlwana, which is obviously a major defeat and of infinitely more material concern than the victory at Rorke's Drift was. Nobody in their right mind is going to question that. But that isn't what my videos were about. They were about a very different battle between different men on a different field at a different time after Isandlwana had already closed. And again, you'll find in both of my other Rorke Drift videos that I'm never representing any one side as being more or less moral or capable as soldiers than the other. So really, I have no clue where this particular comment is coming from. Don't think the Brits won. Didn't lose though. Score draw in a tricky away fixture. I feel like that's a sports reference that I just fundamentally don't understand. But anyways, again, I fail to see how any of this situation could possibly be construed as a draw. The British met their objectives and the Zulu did not. The British remained there and they lived. The Zulu were forced to withdraw or face destruction. It's fairly straightforward, and the Zulu definitely suffered a much bloodier nose than Rorke Drift ever would have been worth. I mean, even if they won, it probably wouldn't have been worth the amount of blood that they had to spill in order to try and win it. On a tactical level and strategic level both, the British benefited from the successful defense of Rorke Drift at least a little bit. And you could argue as well that it was an important victory for morale, things like that. It's not like this battle, somehow ground the war effort to a halt. It's not like it somehow negatively impacted the British overall. It was overall a pretty minor skirmish. But the British, regardless of how important it was or whether they did so impressively or just won it by the skin of their teeth, or however it happened, they did still win the battle and they were better off for it. If the Zulu had never gone to Rorke Drift, they would have been better off for that as well. They were allowed to retreat as the Zulu had achieved their objective the previous day in the comprehensive victory at Isandlwana and hadn't eaten for 2 days. But it was the Zulu who had to retreat, not the Brit. Who's allowing who to retreat here in this comment? And the Zulu victory at Isandlwana doesn't somehow transcend time and space to somehow make their failure to capture Rorke Drift a success. That the Zulu hadn't eaten for 2 days isn't some cop-out that somehow lessens the British victory. It's a logistical and tactical failure on the part of the Zulu that was instrumental in their defeat. Would we say that the Russians didn't win in 1812 against Napoleon because a part of that victory was owed to natural causes and the French supply train not being able to maintain the force? Of course we wouldn't. We would say that's an intrinsic failure on the part of the French that led to their defeat at the hands of the Russians, or not even at the hands of necessarily, but in favor of the Russians who won the campaign. A small station was of no significance in the wider context, so there was no point in attacking it further. Calling it a victory was and still is pure propaganda, lie big enough for Goebbels. The significance of the post or the battle is not relevant. I'm not talking about its importance. I'm just talking about how it played out. We can go on and on, I'm sure, about exactly how important or unimportant the battle was, and I'm sure that I could learn a great deal of things about that from individuals who know more about the battle than myself. But that doesn't somehow change what happened during the battle itself. It could have been the most important or the least important. It doesn't change what happened at the event. And just because the Zulu realized after they were forced to pull back because of the logistical concerns and impending British reinforcements that Rorke Drift wasn't worth the effort, doesn't somehow make their failure turn into a success. That'd just be a case of moving the goalposts after. You can't try to do something, fail at it, and then be like, well, I didn't want to do that anyways. That's not how it works. And honestly, comparing me to a Nazi propagandist, I don't even think we have to go over just how silly that is, although I'll take it as a compliment for me being very charismatic and convincing. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Anyways, what a blathering ignoramus. People give him money for this naughty word? You got that right. And if you're interested in learning more about Skillshare, you can join up with them for a full month for free by clicking on the link in the description down below. Thank you to Skillshare for supporting my content, and thank you, my dear viewer, for supporting the sponsors who support myself. Of course, special thanks as well must be extended to my ever-beneficent and ever-patient supporting classes over at patreon.com, by whose generosity I am able to carry on with my work. Thank you all for watching, and until the next time, my dear viewer, I am and I shall remain your most humble and obedient of servants.